Welcome once again to the Upper Room. Great to be with you. I'm going to have you turn to Romans chapter 1, and then you can put your finger there and flip over to Ephesians chapter 5. And that's going to be the basic text we're going to work with today in our time together. When I was a kid, I used to love to throw any kind of ball in the house, outside the house, broke a lot of windows. I specifically remember, and it came back to my mind because our grandsons like to do this, and that is throwing a ball against the fireplace. And for us, that was down in the basement of our house when I was a kid. And I remember throwing it again and again and again. One time I got a little too high, and I hit a picture of many pictures that were up on the mantle. So I knocked the picture over, and I don't remember what was in the picture frame, but I just remember it falling and breaking, cracking in about 3 places. And I looked at it, and my first thought was, I now must face the wrath of my mom. Now, was that supposed wrath that I thought I had to face, was it real? Was it imagined? I don't even remember getting in trouble, actually. It took her a week or so before she actually noticed it. I was hoping it would take a lifetime, but I don't remember getting in a lot of trouble for that. I don't remember getting a spanking or sent to my room, as though she understood it was an accident, although she probably had told me not to throw the ball against the fireplace a few times. The wrath of somebody. We oftentimes imagine it'll be worse than it is, or maybe it ends up being worse than we thought it would be. So, was my mom's wrath real or just imagined? I think it was probably mostly imagined. But I have the question about God in general for you. Discussion question. Do you believe that the wrath of God is real? And if so, what does it look like? Or is it mostly imagined and people just kind of think, I think that's just there for effect. I don't know. Have a great discussion about that, the wrath of God, because we'll eventually talk more about it. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about the wrath of God. We're going to get to that eventually. It's going to take us a little time. We're in a series, as you know by now, we're calling Habits of the Heart. And within those habits of the heart, where we build this training center and a place to protect our hearts, we have built these walls, the wall of truth, the wall of discipline, and now we're nearing the end of building the wall of discernment, and that's going to be really important. So I ask you to at least put a finger there or have turned to Ephesians 5:6, because that passage pretty much says it all as far as an overall idea of where we're going with this and where we've been as well. And then we'll get deeper into Romans chapter 1. So here we go, Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 6. Let no one, listen to those words, no one. That means no one in the world, no one in the church. Let no one deceive you. Now, how would they deceive us? We've been talking about that, right? Being deceived by the evil one, but we know the evil one uses people. So that's why Paul makes it personal. Let no one, no person deceive you. And now he tells us how they would do that. With empty words. Words that they speak that mean nothing, really. That there's no truth to them whatsoever. And they could use words to deceive us and to lead us down a path we don't want to go, and so it's going to take discernment. Let's go on. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient. Okay, so God's wrath comes at the end of that passage. Again, we'll get to that eventually. So, we go to Romans chapter 1. Here we go. We begin in verse 18, and I'm going to read right through the next 8 verses, and then we'll unpack it. Here we go. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Verse 22, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served created things rather than the Creator, who is forever to be praised. So there are three ideas or concepts in that passage that are indelibly linked together, and that is God's wrath, godless wrapping, I'll explain what I mean by that, and God's revealing. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to flip those upside down, actually. We're going to start, as we unpack that, with God's revealing or his revelation. We're going to discuss what his revelation has always been, what it is still today. Then we'll go on to the godless wrapping, and then end with the wrath of God, or God's wrath. So let's start with the revealing, back to Romans 1, verses 19 and 20. What may be known about God is plain to them. Okay, it's obvious to people. God has made it plain to them, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Okay, so he starts right there with declaring that what God has revealed, he revealed through creation, through what he made, and that we can know his invisible qualities by looking at what he has made. He has revealed himself. The great revelation is that we can look around here and see through the mountains or through oceans or through trees or through whatever sunset, whatever beauty you want to look at, or the amazing power that is obvious now in the universe. We can see his invisible qualities. So we need to talk about that revealing, because that's a reality that, again, people are not going to want to look at, and they may bring us into their deceptive ways if we don't stop and look at it. That brings us to our location, and our location is we are just outside of Montrose, to the west of Montrose, and we're in front of a home, as you can see behind me. It's a beautiful home. In front of this home, it's absolutely remarkable that this home just appeared. It was not here one day. It was just an empty lot, and then the very next day we showed up and it was here. It just appeared. Now you think I'm a moron. And if I really believe that, I am a moron. I'm an idiot to think that it just appeared. This home actually we saw being built in stages. It was built by our good friend Kelly Crippen. He and his wife, and actually his mother-in-law, lives here as well. Over a matter of a year or so, he painstakingly designed this home and built every inch of it. I mean, he is so gifted, and he's not even a home builder by profession. He's a funeral home director. Can you imagine being that talented to be a funeral home director? And oh, by the way, I toss up a house once in a while. He is amazingly talented and gifted, and he's a wonderful guy that loves Jesus. And I ask him, could we be in front of your house? Because I know as a fact that you put every nail in that house. You designed every corner in that house. Every flooring was put down by you. And oh, beyond that, he has a huge shop where he does his work that he built. Okay, why is that important? It's important for the same reason that our piano in our house, and I just noticed this week, ironically, has a little sign on it. We've had this piano for years and years, given to us by good friends in Tucson. All of our kids have taken piano lessons on it, and there's a little sign that I'd never noticed. And the little sign says, built by Baldwin. Now, I didn't need that sign to be there to tell me that somebody built that piano, right? And you don't need me to tell you all about Kelly to know that somebody built this, designed it and built it, because that is plain. And that's the language Paul uses in Romans 1. It is easy to see. It's plain as day. Obviously, you know when somebody has crafted, has built, because nothing that we see in this world, in fact, is Paul's point, was not designed, was not imagined and put together. It's just not that difficult to understand. However, we live in a world that would rather suppress that truth, as simple as it is. I saw a headline this morning that said this: AT&T closing flagship store in San Francisco, citing changing consumer shopping habits. Do they really think we're that stupid? You know why they're closing? Because people keep breaking in and stealing things. That's one way to shop, I guess. The 5-finger discount. But they think we're so stupid. It's so plain because we see it happening all the time, that people are breaking into stores and just cleaning them out. But instead of saying thieves are causing us, lowlifes are causing us to have to shut down this store, they say, oh, shopping habits have changed for our consumers. But that's what they expect us to believe about a house, about the mountains and the ocean and the sunset, that, you know, it's another reason why it's here. And that's where we go today, with the idea that you need to be reminded, and you probably don't, but for what we need to talk about, we need to be reminded that everything we see on this earth, in our bodies, in the universe, was designed by a great designer and intellect, and was built. And that's really an important thing we can't assume everybody agrees upon. So is it just silly me, not real bright kind of guy, that has this assumption or this assertion? I want to take you to Robert Jastrow, who's an astrophysicist and director of NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies. In that title, you can read smart. He's really smart. Here we go. He says, now we see how the astronomical evidence supports the biblical view of the origin of the world. The essential elements in the astronomical and biblical accounts of Genesis are the same. Consider the enormousness of the problem. Science has proved that the universe exploded into being at a certain moment. It asks what cause produced this effect? Who or what put the matter and energy into the universe? And science cannot answer these questions. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak as he pulls himself over the final rock. He is greeted by a band of theologians there who have been there for centuries. As the scientist, the all-knowing scientist, gets up over the top to see where did all this come from, theologians, people who know God, know already where it all came from, is what Jastrow is saying. Here's the reality of the situation. Astronomers can observe objects 4 billion light years away. That's 25 septillion miles. I don't even know what a septillion is. At any given time, there are an average of 1,800 storms on our planet. The energy needed to generate those storms amounts to the incredible figure of 1,200,000,000 horsepower. By comparison, a large earth-moving machine has 420 horsepower and requires 100 gallons of fuel a day to operate. Just one of those storms, of the 1,800 every day, producing a rain of 4 inches over an area of 10,000 square miles, would require energy equivalent to the burning of 640 million tons of coal to evaporate enough water for such a rain. To cool those vapors and collect them in clouds would take another 800 million horsepower of refrigeration working night and day for 100 days. Are you still with me? Let's go on. The average farmer in Minnesota gets 407,510 gallons of rainwater per acre per year. Free of charge, of course. Missouri has 70,000 square miles and averages 38 inches of rain a year. That amount of water is equal to a lake 250 miles long, 60 miles wide, and 22 feet deep. Again, free of charge. There are at least 10 million species of insects, including some 1,500 varieties of ants. There are about 5 billion birds in the United States, with some species able to fly 500 miles nonstop across the Gulf of Mexico. Mallard ducks can fly 60 miles an hour, eagles can fly 100 miles per hour, and falcons can dive at speeds at 180 miles per hour. The Earth is 25,000 miles in circumference, weighing 6 septillion, 588 sextillion tons, and hangs unsupported in space. It spins at 1,000 miles per hour with absolute precision and careens through space around the sun at the speed of 1,000 miles per minute in an orbit 580 million miles long. Are you still with me? The human heart is about the size of its owner's fist. An adult heart weighs less than half a pound. Yet, it can do enough work in 12 hours to lift 65 tons 1 inch off the ground. A water molecule is composed of only 3 atoms. But if all of the molecules in one drop of water were the size of a grain of sand, they could make a road 1 foot thick and a half-mile wide that would stretch from Los Angeles to New York. You getting the point? We could go on and on and on and on, never ending, as we begin to understand the complexities that had to have a designer. That couldn't have just happened by accident. John MacArthur, the author and pastor, puts it this way: except to a mind willfully closed to the obvious, it is inconceivable that such power, intricacy, and harmony could have developed by any means but that of a master designer who rules the universe. Okay, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm going to have you do some other things, some other homework, if you will, to kind of finish out the picture I'm trying to create for you. First of all, you could go back to lesson number 3, way back when we first began this ministry, where I talked about Jesus the Creator, and I talk in there about the anthropic principle and all kinds of really cool things that you need to know again, and maybe you need a refresher on. So you can watch that again. I also encourage you highly to watch the movie Is Genesis History by Del Tackett. It's an amazing look at fossils and how everything supports the creation account. Finally, if you want to do some serious study and some fun study, I direct you to Dr. Stephen Meyer, who, by the way, got his doctorate from Cambridge University, no slouchy institution, and his degree was in molecular biology and the history of physics. Now, the great thing about Dr. Myers is that he actually talks like a normal human being. You think with all those advanced degrees, you would never be able to understand him. He does a good job of talking down to at least my level. I specifically would direct you to his most recent book, and that book is called The Return of the God Hypothesis, where he covers a lot of these kinds of things, and he challenges what we're challenging today, but he does it in a brilliant way. So Paul and Barnabas were on a missionary trip in Lystra. So the people they were around were the Listerines. Kind of. All right, so they heal a guy, and when they heal this guy, all of a sudden the crowd turns on them not to harm them, but to worship them, believing they are gods who have come down from the heavens. I want to read this to you, because when they're pressed and when they're in this kind of trouble, it's fascinating what they turn to. So we're in Acts chapter 14, verse 14. But when the apostles, Barnabas and Paul, heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God." These worthless things are the things of this world that they believe they should worship. And then they say this: "Who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. In the past he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their seasons. He provides you with plenty of food and fills your hearts with joy." Where does Paul turn? I'm assuming it's Paul, could be Barnabas, but I think he speaks for both of them. Where does he turn? So in this moment of maybe panic, when they're turning to worship them, and Paul and Barnabas know they can't allow this to happen, where do they turn? They turn to creation. They turn to creation. The God who created everything. That's where they go. They say, you've got to know this. And not only is he the great creator, but he's a good God who has given to you out of his kindness things that you could never have come up with on your own. like water for your fields, right? And food for your table. That's where they turn. And so that's where we must begin. Next, we find Paul amongst the pagans in Athens, and he sees all those gods and he's disturbed. And here's what he says to the Athenians in Acts chapter 17, verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by human hands. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. And so he did it with the Listerines, now with the Athenians. He goes back and says, you need to know about God as the creator of all things. And oh, by the way, he's a good God. He gives you breath and everything you need to live. You might remember that we read from the book of Job last lesson, where Job says, all God has to do is withdraw his breath and everyone goes back to dust. That's what Paul is referring to here. Now, this might beg the question for you, which it does for most people, if Paul is saying it's easy, it's plain to see, where did all this creation come from? You should know better than to worship other gods. You might be saying, what about those people who live in those remote parts of the world and never see or hear of somebody talking of Jesus? That's a question a lot of people ask as an out, so you really don't need Jesus. I will take you to Romans 1:20 once again. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature has been clearly seen by what? A few? No. They are being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. People in general, around the world, we have no excuse because we can see the invisible qualities of God in creation. Because we, all people, can see the invisible qualities and power of God in what he created, and thus we have no excuse whatsoever. Theologian Charles Hodge put it this way: God therefore has never left himself without a witness. His existence and perfections have ever been so manifested that his rational creatures are bound to acknowledge and worship him as the true and only God. And so I took you back to Genesis, right? Creation. In the beginning, God created. Paul took us back to Genesis, both in Romans and there again in the book of Acts, we see him doing this, and all the way through to the book of Revelation, the very last book of the Bible. Revelation chapter 4, verse 10 says, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne, that would be Jesus, and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne, and they say, you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. All things. So from the beginning of the Bible to the very end of the Bible, the beginning of time as we know it to the end of time as we will know it on this earth, it's all about the Creator and how he created all things. There is a designer. Everything, whether it's a piano in our house or a house behind me, was designed and built, and thus the universe. So that's the revelation. That's the revealing. Now let's go to the wrapping. Now what do I mean by the wrapping? I don't mean boop, 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 boop. You can tell that I don't have it in my genes. The wrapping is meant by concealing something, cloaking something, deceiving, right? When I get a gift and it's wrapped for a certain reason. The giver does not want me to know what it is immediately, and so they wrap it, they conceal it, they cloak it. And there is a cloaking, there is a deception that's going on that Paul mentioned both in Romans 1 and Ephesians 5:6. And so that's where we're going to land today, is on that idea of what has been cloaked. What is the deception? Why do we need the wall of discernment? Discussion question number 2. What do you think is the big lie in today's world, today's culture? What's the big lie? That could have lasted a long time, right? There's a lot you could choose from. Like, there was one gunman that killed JFK. We actually landed on the moon. People think that could be a lie. Everybody has a soulmate. Is that true, or is that a big lie? How about this? There is a gay gene. That is, there is a genetic code inside some people that just really takes them that direction. So for God to say don't live that way is wrong of God. How about this lie? You get to choose your gender. I just heard on the radio this week, it was so funny. There's actually a young lady, I think probably in her early 20s, that is suing her parents for $5,000 a month because they did not get permission from her to bring her into this world. True story. I listened to her. She's suing them because they didn't get permission from her. Now, she was asked, now how would they have got permission? She said, well, obviously you go to a psychic and the psychic gets a hold of me before I'm born and asks me if it's okay. They didn't do that. Do you think that's a lie, maybe? There's a lot of lies to choose from. Today we land on what I'm going to call the big lie. And it's a big lie, and it supports the biggest lie. Okay, what is the big lie? One evolutionist once said, I refuse to believe in God, so what other alternative do I have except evolution? All right, and that says it all. The argument of evolution, of how we view science, comes down to worldview. My worldview is there's no God. So the big lie supports the biggest lie. The biggest lie, there is no God. So what's the big lie? Well, we find it in Romans chapter 1, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth. What truth are they suppressing? Well, you know, we already read it. It has to do with, did God make the universe? Did God make the world? And so the godless wrapping, the cloaking, comes down to this one idea. The big lie is what we're calling it today. So the big lie, here we go, you've been waiting for it, is this. Science and faith are incompatible. Okay? We see it everywhere. All the schools, whether they're from the youngest age, clear up through the universities and doctorate level studies, they all maintain this as truth, but they're suppressing the truth, we know now from Paul. So again, the big lie is that science and faith in a creator cannot coexist. They just don't work together. So you have to choose one or the other. And what goes along with this lie is the underlying belief that if you choose science, you're intelligent. If you choose belief in a creator, you are not very bright. All right, so we're going to deal with that. That's the wrapping. That's the cloaking. That's the suppressing of the truth. It is what Paul said in Ephesians 5:6, empty words. Those are empty words, that idea. Now, here's the problem. I don't know for sure, but I think maybe half the people in the church believe it. They actually believe that science can have nothing to do with faith, and faith in God, a creator, can have nothing to do with science. And the intelligent person chooses science, and the unintelligent person, not able to understand all the intricacies of science, chooses easily faith in God. And that's a problem, because that supports the big lie. There is no God. And when you start believing that, then we will talk about what comes next. Back to Romans 1, verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified, they didn't honor God as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. This is a very dark perspective. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles, created things. Okay, that's where they put their focus and attention on honoring the creation, not the creator. So I'm here to tell you, the scripture is very clear that refusing to acknowledge God, honor God, thank God for being creator is a fool's game. Psalm chapter 14 verse 1, David writes, the fool says in his heart there is no God. It's the fool, not who says there is a God, but the fool who says there is no God, who says there's only science. Romans 1:25, back to Romans 1. They then exchanged the truth about God for a lie, because it's wrapped in lie. It's a suppression of truth. And they worshiped and served created things rather than creator. So the big lie that Paul is getting at is science and faith cannot coexist. You have to choose one or the other. And obviously, faith means you believe in a creator, which we all know did not happen. Now, interestingly, polls show that most people think there is a creator, even though we've been bombarded since the time we were children by our education systems, by the media, by the government, being told that Faith in God is a simpleton's way of life, and science is for the bright people. I find it interesting that Paul says that these people, these foolish people, will then turn to creation, to things that they can touch, and put their trust and faith and worship in them. Hindus have some 330 million gods. That's about 8 gods per family. They also worship cows, as you know, and other creatures. The Buddhists revere a 2-inch long kind of stained tooth that was taken supposedly from Buddha at his funeral in 543 BC. And so they kind of worship that tooth. You know, we will find something besides God in our foolishness. So let's get back to the phrase Paul wrote, and that is, they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. The truth about God is He's creator. The lie is evolution, right? Evolution was the theory that came up to supplant God as creator, so we don't have to go that direction. And that is, by the way, the law of the land, pretty much. When the state of Louisiana many years ago said, we want to teach both creation and evolution, the Supreme Court decided they could not require that both be taught. We're going to stick with evolution because that's what the bright people really believe. So let me say this right up front. I've said it before, but it's worth mentioning again. It really comes down to what is meant by what word. So when the word evolution is used, we can't just assume that we're all on the same page. There are 2 kinds of evolution. There's microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is change within species. And we all know that that happens. There are many breeds of dogs. There's many kinds of trees, right? But they're still trees. They're still dogs, all right? That's microevolution. Nobody argues that, okay? And that's science. So even those of us who are not so bright and have, just a belief in God as creator, understand that microevolution, change within species, happens all the time, everywhere, okay? So when they say that, we're not bright enough to understand that concept, we are. It's macroevolution. It's the idea that there was a jump. There had to be a jump at some point in evolution from one species to another. And I mentioned in the last lesson, they have never found that link between man and ape, and they have not found any links. Every once in a while, they come up with, oh, we found it. They celebrate and throw a party, and you come to find out it was all a hoax, okay? That has never been found because there are no jumps from species to species. That does not happen. That is, when they talk about evolution, that's what they're talking about. And that's what we oppose. Not micro, but macro. So, is science the enemy of faith? Where did that idea come from? How long has it been around? Okay, let's start digging into this. Here we go. David Barash, who is a professor at the University of Washington, he's a professor of evolutionary psychology, puts it succinctly in his book this way: as evolutionary science has progressed, the available space for religious belief has narrowed. Science has undermined belief in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God, that is, a creator who is good. Notice those things go together. Paul put them together. This guy puts them together. There is no all-present God that created everything, and if there was, he's not good. So that has gone away as science has progressed. And then there are the new atheists, the most famous of whom is Richard Dawkins, and he claims that as science has progressed, we have moved more towards atheism and a materialistic worldview, and it all makes sense for the intelligent person. He goes on to say this: the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at the bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, no nothing, but blind, pitiless indifference. I don't know how you can say it with a straight face. I guess he believes that houses just poof, exist. And pianos just exist. Unfortunately, they put a sign on there that ruined that idea. Put the Baldwin people made that happen. He goes on to say what we are saying that is the big lie. He says, so science and belief in a God cannot coexist. They are in conflict. In fact, he goes on to say they've always been at war with one another. And sadly, too many of us believe that. Even in the church, we believe, well, you can talk science and you can talk faith in a God, but those don't get along. Okay, I'm going to show you that's a lie from the pit of hell. You probably know that in 1859, Charles Darwin put forth the idea of evolution in his book, The Origin of Species. Actually, he stole that idea from his grandfather and some other people, but that's another book altogether. Here's what a guy who came after him, who was an ardent supporter of the idea and of Darwin himself, a guy by the name of John William Draper in 1874, wrote this: Christianity and science are recognized by their respective adherents as being absolutely incompatible. They cannot exist together. One must yield to the other. Mankind must make its choice. It cannot have both. We can't say that science is true and there's a creator. You can't do that, he says. And so from that point on, from 1874 down through today, well over 100 years later, that silly mantra, that dribble, continues to be a theme in all educational institutions. I mentioned Dr. Stephen Meyer and his book, The Return of the God Hypothesis, and in his brilliance he shows that there are at least 18 historians and philosophers and sociologists of science in the last many years who have said that the origins of science in the 16th and 17th centuries came from people who believed in a creator and believed that he originated everything. So these are world-class philosophers. I have them in the notes. You can get his book, but I have them in the notes. Your leader can give them those names and you can look them up. But these are world-class philosophers, historians, people who have studied science, and that's their claim. One of them, Steve Fuller, put it this way: Western science is grounded in the belief that the natural order is the product of a single intelligence from which our own intelligence descends. Another one of those philosophers, a guy by the name of Holmes Ralston III, said, it was monotheism that launched the coming of physical science, for it premised an intelligible world, sacred but disenchanted, a world with a blueprint which was therefore open to the searches of the scientists, the great pioneers in physics, Newton, Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, devoutly believed themselves called to find evidence of God in the physical world. You can go all the way back to Johannes Kepler, who lived from 1571 to 1630, who was an astronomer, a world-class astronomer, mathematician, astrologer, natural philosopher, and he said this: God wanted us to recognize natural laws, and that God made this possible by creating us after his own image so that we could share in his own thoughts. In the 13th century, there was a theologian by the name of William of Ockham, and he came up with a theory called Occam's razor. I don't know if you've ever heard of it before. It's pretty famous. And it's a very actually simple theory. And he said it this way, I'll explain it: never posit pluralities without necessity. That is, don't come up with all kinds of complicated explanations for something that's very simple. The simplest answer is always the right answer, is what he proposed and is still around today. The simplest answer is, if you see a house, somebody probably built it. If you see a piano or a watch, somebody probably built it, right? Pretty simple. Okay, that's where we're at. Occam's razor is true. You see creation, there had to be a creator. I do not have enough faith to believe that out of nothing came something. There's nothing in this world that ever does that. Out of nothing comes something. Robert Boyle, the 17th century chemist and mechanical philosopher, likened nature to a clock and a book. And he used those metaphors because he specifically said every clock has a clockmaker, every book has an author. It's as plain as the nose on your face, right? I mean, we don't look at anything that's been made in this world and say it did not have a maker. It just came about on its own. So going way back to the 13th century and since, all the really smart science people said this is the truth. Since then, we've come up with ways to suppress the truth, and now it's the common mantra that our children, grandchildren, all people are being taught in this culture. It is the suppression of truth. Or on the other hand, you might know that social evolutionists, people who saw evolution, that theory that everything came from nothing, but the survival of the fittest is really the key to how we all evolved. Social evolutionists are all for this. You might remember the names Karl Marx and Adolf Hitler. Now, they were social evolutionists. In fact, Marx put it this way: Darwin suits my purpose. Darwin supports what I want to do, and that is the murdering of millions of people. Unspeakable suffering comes as a result of thinking survival of the fittest. That's the way it's got to happen. Okay, let's make this simple. My take on this is this. I bet you've never heard this before. I'd never thought of it until this week. My take is this. Science is John the Baptist. Science is John the Baptist. Who was John the Baptist? He was the one who came before and prepared the way for the Messiah, who explained who he was and how we need to direct our attention to him. Science is John the Baptist. Science comes and points us to the Creator. And that's really what's happening. As the science gets better, unfortunately, for those who want to suppress the truth, they're in dire straits. Things are getting a little dicey for the people who say only science exists, because science is now pointing us to God. Whether it's a microscope or a giant telescope out in space, or it's 3D sonograms looking inside the womb of a mother, the more science evolves, the more it progresses, the better it gets, the more clearer we see God and all that he has created. So that's the gist of this lesson. Okay, you got it? All right, there's a big lie, and that is science and faith can't coexist, they're at war with one another. That's a huge lie. But it supports the biggest lie, and that is there is no God. But we would be remiss to stop there and not get back to how Romans 1 began. Here we go, verse 18. The wrath of God is being constantly revealed. The word revealed is apokauto, like Acapulco, kind of. And it means to uncover, bring to light, or make known. So the wrath of God is becoming known from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So we've talked about the truth being suppressed by the rappers, the ones who want to coat truth and hide it from us. Now we find out, going back to the beginning of this passage, the wrath of God is now going to be revealed against all of that. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over in their sinful desires of their hearts to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies and one another. And we see that. God is giving over. God is allowing. That's part of his wrath, I believe. I'll let you live with the consequences of your choices. Now I ask you what you thought about the wrath of God. I think the wrath of God either gets a bad rap or people don't think it exists at all. When does the wrath of God come? Is it true? Donald Gray Barnhouse recounted the story of a group of farmers in the Midwest that were infuriated when they were having church services and the farmer across the street, hated God, was an atheist, and so he would plow while they were having services, kicking up dust, and it was loud. And so they complained about his choice to do that. And he did say he was doing it on purpose. In fact, he wrote an editorial to the local newspaper, and he asked, how is it possible, if God doesn't want me doing this, if there is a God, that I have the best crops in all the county? And I have had for several years. And so the editor put his letter in and then put a PS. And the editor's PS read like this: God does not settle all his accounts in the month of October. And that's what I want you to know. It's the same thing Peter said in 2 Peter 3:9. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some count slowness. Instead, he is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. Repentance is the key. Now, as we talk about the wrath of God for just a second, you need to know that God is a patient God. It's obvious, isn't it? I tell you, if I was God, this place would have been toast a long time ago. God is a patient God. He doesn't want anyone to perish, even though it may sound like it when we talk about his wrath. So, here we go. 2 weeks ago, in the First Congregational Church in Spencer, Massachusetts, a church building that was built in 1743, who is all about the alphabet people and promoting the alphabet way of life, was hit by a bolt of lightning and exploded and burned up. And so the question on the internet is, did God do that for the stance they are taking of immorality? I don't know. You decide. I do know the wrath of God is a real thing. God's anger is found in several Hebrew words in the Old Testament: hara, haran, haman, katash, and it means heated, burning with fury, fierce, bitter, venom, and indignation. Those words appear 187 times in the Old Testament. The word itself, wrath, is the word orge, refers to a settled, determined indignation. Get that. A settled, determined indignation. In other words, the wrath of God is not just a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction of anger. It is something that is well thought out, and it has been determined, and it is based on indignation concerning when people deny his existence and worship other gods. And that's what that's about. I would suggest that when Jesus went into the temple, it was a predetermined thing that he would do. That he was not screaming out of anger and, flustered and emotional. That it was very much, I need to do this to show you what the house of the Lord is about and what it's not about. So you don't have to go very far back into the Old Testament or starting into the Old Testament to see that God flooded the world and that he burned Sodom and Gomorrah, and those were very much under control. This is what I'm going to do, planned because of man's rebellion, man's refusal to acknowledge who I am. And he is God, and he has the right to do whatever he wants. And I can tell you, again, he's more patient than I would have been. Habakkuk 1:13, your eyes are too pure to look on evil. You cannot tolerate wrongdoing. British commentator Geoffrey B. Wilson put it this way: God is no idle spectator of world events. He is dynamically active in human affairs. The conviction of sin is constantly punctuated by divine judgment. Well, see, that's the Old Testament, please. Okay, let's go to the New Testament. And of course, we find Ananias and Sapphira struck down for lying to God. And then in Acts chapter 12, verse 21, on the appointed day, Herod, wearing his royal robe, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. They shouted, "This is the voice of a God, not a man!" Immediately, because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Verse 24, but the word of God continued to spread and flourish. You see, it's very well determined that if you are going to say there is no God and that actually I am God, which is a lot of what people do with science, we are God. Science is a tool. It doesn't mean we're God. Again, as I mentioned earlier, Ephesians 5:6 says, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of such things, God's wrath comes on those who are disobedient, who just absolutely will disregard who God is and what he says, want nothing to do with him. Colossians 3:5-6, put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry. Bummer, because we kind of like to have greed in this country, but he calls it idolatry. Anyway, because of these, the wrath of God is coming. John 3:36, John is talking about Jesus. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life, but whoever rejects the Son will not see life, for God's wrath remains on them. It's a New Testament thing too. God's calculated decision to pour out retribution on those who mock him, who make fun of him, who pretend like he doesn't exist, like we're here on our own. He is very much justified in pouring out his wrath as the God of the universe. In the end, the lie that science and faith are incompatible or are at war with one another, I think, is pretty easily diffused, and we, at least in the church, need to get past that lie, not be deceived. Let no one deceive you, as Paul says. We've got to get past that and realize that science and faith actually work hand in glove, hand in hand. I believe, again, science leads us to God, and so it's a great tool. Physicist and theologian John Polkinghorne said, science and religion are friends, not foes, in the common quest for knowledge. I want to end on kind of a light note. A lot of that was, especially the wrath of God stuff, was pretty heavy, but it's real, and we need to take him seriously. There is a professor of zoology at Ohio State University by the name of Tim Berra, and he wrote a book entitled Evolution and the Myth of Creationism, a basic guide to the facts in the evolution debate. So it's a book for dummies, like me, so I can understand what evolution is. Okay, so I want to quote from him how he explains evolution to dummies like me. Okay, and here's my quote. It's lengthy because it takes some time for us to get it through our thick skulls. Here's what he says. Everything evolves in the sense of descent and modification, whether it be government, policy, religion, sports cars, or organisms. The revolutionary fiberglass Corvette evolved from more mundane automotive ancestors in 1953. The highest point in the Corvette's evolutionary refinement included the 1962 model, in which the original 102-inch was shortened to 98 inches and the new closed-up coupe Stingray model was introduced. The 1968 model, the forerunner of today's Corvette morphology, which emerged with removable roof panels, and the 1978 Silver Anniversary model with fastback styling. Today's version continues the stepwise refinements that have been accumulating since 1953. The point is that the Corvette evolved through a selection process acting on variations that resulted in a series of transitional forms and an endpoint rather distinct from the starting point. A similar process shapes the evolution of organisms. You actually put that in a book. Hello, McFly. Those Corvettes all had intelligent designers and builders. Intelligence was behind it all. Corvettes didn't pop up, and new Corvettes pop up or evolve. Everybody knows that. So the dummy who's writing for dummies doesn't get the idea of evolution. That's a classic example of suppressing the truth. Newsweek in July 20th, 1998 said the more deeply scientists see into the secrets of the universe, you'd expect, the more God would fade away from their hearts and minds. Wouldn't we all expect that? The more we understand science, the less we think about God. But it's just the opposite. I've mentioned this guy before, but let's end with him, and that is the great Alan Sandage, the greatest observational cosmologist in the world. He was a protege of Edwin Hubble, if that name sounds familiar, and here's how he says it, and we'll end this way. It was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science. It was only through the supernatural that I can understand the mystery of existence. Many scientists are now driven to faith by their very work. And there you go. Science is John the Baptist, introducing us to God, introducing us to the Son of God. That's all it is. It's a great tool. They're not incompatible. They work together. And so I implore you not to buy the big lie that supports the biggest lie, that there is no God. When we buy into the big lie, we don't realize we're going down a path that is very dangerous. And yes, the wrath of God is real. And so we decide with the wall of discernment, we must have the wall of discernment to understand these things. They're not that difficult, but the wall of discernment that God gives us is so essential for our lives and living for Him. Thanks for joining us. Great to be with you in front of my buddy's creation. Yes, his creation. An intelligent man he is. God bless.